Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to look at Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club. So I first read this book a very long time ago in high school for my AP Junior English class. And I reread it recently. I do not have a copy. I borrowed it from my library. It actually took almost 2 months because, again, it's pretty common of a book to read in high school. As something people basically choose to read. It's one of those books they actually give you an option for. The rare things they do in high school. At least they did back when I was in school. So The Joy Luck Club is interesting. It was written by Amy Tan, who is she is Chinese American. Her parents, I don't know whether both her parents or just her mother. I think it was just both her parents that immigrated from China. So this is not an autobiography. In fact, the introduction of this says, no, I'm not married. I don't have children. Well, no, she is married. She's been married for a very long time. She does not have children. She has dogs. So it is a mixture of some various stories that she's heard from her mother and other women, basically daughters of Chinese immigrants and their mothers. So it's a kind of a combination. So it's completely fiction. So what this book is, it's not one coherent story. It tells a story. Now, the Joy Luck Club was something that the main narrator, which is June, I think that's her American term. Let's see, Jing Mei Wu, and she goes by June. Basically what's happened is before the book starts, her mother, and again I'm switching back to the titles, is Su Yan Wu has died. She has a brain aneurysm. And her and 3 other friends, Anna May Hansu, Lindu Young, and Ying Ying or Betty St. Clair, they started what she calls a Joy Luck Club, where they get together every week. They play, what on earth is it? Mahjong, which is, I believe it's a matching game. I'm not entirely familiar with it. It's a matching game with tiles. And so they would get together every week and play and gossip and eat and kind of enjoy life. And so at the beginning of this book, June's mother, Su Yan, probably mispronouncing that, has died. And her June's father essentially invites her to be part of the Joy Luck Club, and I believe and because that's his decision who he invites to join the club to replace her, because I believe I can't remember who was it. I think it's Lena St. Betty St. Clair's husband who died. I think she invited a brother or a brother-in-law to join. And yes, the men are part of this. And essentially you see that June she's invited to this. She's not quite sure what to do. She feels very uncomfortable to be playing with these women who she's known since childhood. And she finds it partially very strange, also because they only play for a small amount of money, and then they started investing in the stock market. And she asks, like, when did you start doing this? They're like, when they originally started playing, the same people were winning and losing. So they decided, let's just invest in the stock market. Therefore, everybody can win and lose equally, and then they play the game with just a couple of dollars. So it's not a big thing. So they're kind of starting to do it from fun. The other thing she finds out is now throughout her childhood, her mother would tell her about how she escaped the war and abandoned these 2 baby girls. And June never quite understood what happened. And she comes to find out that her mother has been searching for her daughters for all these years. And that right before she died, they found them. And so the Joy Luck Club, particularly the women, have pooled their money and have decided to send June and her father back to China to meet these 2 women. but they have not. Basically, they wrote a letter back to the sisters using her mother's name without telling them that their mother had died. It's like, we can't tell this in a letter. You have to tell them in person. So that's kind of the first part of the story. And then it goes through a couple different parts of different stories of the past and literally the present. So you go through the stories of the mothers and then some of the stories of the daughters. So, and I'm going to slightly spin this because it's a very good book, but I've only read it twice. So I have to kind of look at the Wikipedia page to remember what this is. So the first section is called Feathers from a Thousand Li Away. And this is the mothers. So you have the first story that tells the story of basically the beginning, what I just explained, of Jing Mei Wu and her late mother, who founded the Joy Luck Club. And it tells the story of how her mother founded the Joy Luck Club years ago. Her first husband was an officer. This is during World War II. He was an officer in the military. He sent her back to, they left Shanghai with their babies. He sent her, come to this town. It'll be safe. I'm going to go off fighting here. And it's poor. The thousands of people who are escaping the war show up. The smell of death is everywhere. People are starving. And she gets together with a couple of women that she's met. And every week they play mahjong and they feast, essentially. And they try to forget. And they tell stories of the past and laugh and their dreams for the future. And then at one point in time, another officer shows up and tells her, the Japanese are coming. You need to get the heck out of here because they will kill her immediately because she's an officer's wife. So now she's wealthy. And again, she's an officer's wife in China. Her family comes from wealth. So she packs up her kids and packs up her stuff and starts walking, hoping to catch a ride. Only there are so many people trying to flee the city that the cars are just driving by quickly. So she starts dropping things, and a lot of people do. It's like you start dropping the valuables, everything that's first things that are heavy. And eventually she had a wheelbarrow that she was pushing her babies in, and eventually that breaks. So she ties her children, her two twin daughters, who are maybe 1 or 2 at the time, in slings, and she's carrying them, and she's dropping things slowly. And then eventually she's exhausted, she's starving, she has blisters on her hands, she has blisters on her feet. She sets the babies down, she tells them she's going to go find them something to eat, and walks off and eventually collapses. And she's put pictures in their clothing, she's put jewels in their clothing, and she leaves them, and she doesn't know what happens to them. And that's that first story. And then eventually she comes to the U.S. So then you have the story of, and first find out her husband. She wakes up, she's being taken away from the Red Cross. She can't find her kids, and her first husband's dead. And eventually she basically meets her second husband, and they search for them, and eventually they come to the U.S. So it tells that beginning story. And then it tells the story of the childhoods of the other 3 women. You have Anime Hansu, who tells the story of how essentially her mother became the 4th concubine to this wealthy man. And she herself was raised by her grandparents when her grandmother was dying. This is her maternal grandmother. Her mother shows up and tries to save her, making a soup out of her own flesh. So that's that story. And then you have the story of Lindu Young, how she was essentially, she was promised in marriage to I can't remember if it was it may have been the matchmaker's child when she was 2 years old. He was a year younger than her. And how basically her family, she was no longer theirs at this point. She was promised to this other woman and her son. And eventually she knew who he was. After a while, he was a spoiled, bratty little boy. And when their parents' house flooded and they had to leave, she was left at, I think, age 12 with this family. And she was treated like a servant and taught how to cook and clean, and to her mother-in-law's views, become a good wife. until she reached a certain age where they were officially married, and they pretty much shared a bed like brother and sister. And and how she figures out, she sees a servant girl who's pregnant and figures out, how the heck can I get out of this? And convinces them that this woman is the son's spiritual wife, that the ancestors have planted his child in her womb, and they buy it, and they give her money to go to, I think, Shanghai and eventually the United States, and gets out. And then you have the story of Ying St. Clair, and how she fell into a lake as a small child and was lost, and how this kind of traumatized her. So that's the first section. And then you have the next section. You have the 26 malignant gates. So this is the daughters. So this is their tales. So the first tale is of Waverly Young, and how she learned to play chess and became a chess prodigy, and how she got angry because her mother was essentially using her as a trophy. And then you have, let's see, you have Lena's story. So that's the next daughter. What is her last name? Lena St. Clair. So St. Clair essentially tells the story of how her mother would tell this old story of how her great-grandfather sentenced a beggar to die, and then how when they moved from Chinatown to Oakland, the house was different, and her mother gives birth to a little boy who, I can't pronounce what essentially it is, but he had a birth defect that essentially he was born without parts of his skull or his brain, and kind of died right there, and how her mother became a ghost. So, and I think Lena's an only child. And then she tells the story, then you have the story of Rose Hansu Jordan, and how she's apparently talking to her mother first about how she's planning to get divorced, and then she relates to an incident where her own brother, when they went to the beach, her brother Bing drowns, and her mother essentially becomes a ghost. And then you have the story of June, whose mother constantly wants her to be some sort of prodigy. Remember, these girls grew up together. So the girl who was the chess prodigy, she's bragging about her child, and June's mother desperately wants her to be some sort of prodigy, so she trades cleaning services to have June learn the piano. And June learns that she doesn't really want to do this. She's not very good at it. The guy who's teaching her is partially deaf, so she can get away with all sorts of things. And eventually she quits. And then her mother gives her this piano years later, and she refurbishes it, and her mother tells her, you could still be good if you kind of stop having self-doubt. So that's the next part. Then you have the American translation. So this moves into the adult stories of the mothers. Or is it adult? No. Yeah, no, it's the daughters as adults. So it starts off with Lena and her issues with her husband, Harold, and how her mother sees that they're in an unequal relationship. They're technically splitting everything, but they're both in an architectural firm, and Harold is her boss, and he earns a heck of a lot more money than she does, and yet they're still splitting things down the middle. He's insisting that she pay for flea things and pay half the rent and all sorts of things, and her mother sees this, and she wants to teach her daughter that basically she has worth. So, and essentially that, and how she basically breaks a table leg and tries to get her daughter to pay attention, that she's being abused essentially, and that she has power. And then you have the next story of, Waverly, who worries about her mother's opinion of her second fiance. She married younger and had a daughter. And he's not Chinese, he's not Asian at all, he's a white guy, and how she tries to hide it from her because she's afraid of her mother's judgment, as her mother had judged her first husband. And I don't know whether she divorced him partially because of her mother's opinion. And she's constantly trying to kind of hide him, that she's in love with the second guy because she's afraid she's going to break up with him because of her mother's opinions. And eventually her mother essentially reveals, like, no, I like this guy. And it's kind of, she basically, mom's like, I know what you were hiding the entire time, kind of thing. And then you have the story of, again, you have Rose Hansu, and so she finds out she's in the middle of a divorce. She finds out her husband's planning to remarry, and she, with the advice of her mother, finds her own strength to hire her own lawyer and to fight back against him and to stand up for what she is worth. So, and then, let's see, I'm skimming through this because, again, I just only read this book once. And, yeah. And then you have the story of Jingmei. Now, she never finished college, and she's of the belief that her mother thinks she's useless. And how she's not as worthy as, say, Waverly. Again, all these young women grow up together because their mothers are friends. So, and I believe Waverly's company tries to get her to, I think, Jingmei she's a writer. So they try to get her to write some sort of advertising thing, and essentially Waverly embarrasses her. And Jingmei thinks she's not as worthy in her mother's eyes. And her mother tells her, it's like, no, Waverly has no soul. And essentially, you do. You have heart, you have kindness, and she finds out that her mother loves and accepts her. So, and then the last part of it goes back mostly to the mothers and how they deal with difficult choices. So, Anime reveals what happened after her grandmother dies. She goes to live with her mother, who is the fourth wife of this man. And she learns how the second wife, essentially how her mother ended up in this position. The second wife of this man arranged when her mother was away, I think, praying, and offered, why don't you just come over, and befriended her and spend the night. And basically she arranged for Anime's mother to be raped and disgraced and eventually thrown out of her family home because she had been disgraced by this man. They blame her, not him. So she ends up becoming his third concubine, because he has a first wife who gave him 2 daughters, who's now hooked on opium, and his daughters are useless. And you have the second wife, who was a dancer and who's very manipulative, who can't have children. And so she gets the second concubine, who unfortunately ends up with 2 children, but this woman fakes suicide like crazy. So the second wife does this in order to get complete control. So she has full control. And then again, she arranges for Anime's mother to get raped, and eventually Anime's mother gives birth to a son. And the second wife takes the child, essentially. And Anime realizes her mother is miserable, and then he comes home with a fourth concubine, a fifth wife, who's a poor girl. And again, the second wife tries to control everything and make sure this woman understands just where she came from. And essentially, Anime's mother is a sex toy for this man. He'll sleep with his one wife and come to the other wife. So Anime tells how her mother essentially poisoned herself right before the Lunar New Year, where essentially on purpose, in order to give her daughter power, because ghosts come back and all debts must be paid at the new year. And so this man had to, basically in order to prevent the belief that Anime's mother would come back and haunt him, he would raise Anime and her brother as if they were the wives of his first wife and his only children. So, and the second one, of course, now has no power because he's now absolutely utterly terrified of being haunted by this woman that he had obviously raped, and the child was not being raised as hers. So, and she had actually given him a son, and he's essentially afraid. And that's her story. And Anna May learns the basically power of that to gain her own strength and her own power, because her mother used basically suicide to give her daughter a better life, essentially, because her power was taken away from her, so she gave it back to her daughter. And then, let's see, then you have the story of Ying Ying St. Clair, how she realizes how her first husband was a womanizer, how she aborted her child she was pregnant with because she knew it would trap her. She was young. And how she eventually went to the country, lived there for several years. She was wealthy. And eventually, after several years of almost mourning to an extent and living in poverty, she takes the money, she goes back, and she works in a shop where she meets an American. And once she lets him court her for 4 years, making him believe that she had wealth far beyond his dreams. She was from a very, very wealthy family. And once her husband dies after 4 years, she gets a note that he died with a prostitute because he had left her. He had left her for dancers and various other women. And once she finds out he dies, she agrees to marry St. Clair and essentially give up everything just to go to the U.S. and become a ghost. And I do believe he eventually dies. So, and then it tells the last story of Lindu Young and how she met Anna May when she came to the U.S. on her own, and they were working in a fortune cookie factory. And how eventually Anna May introduced her to her future husband, even though they spoke a different language. They're both Chinese, but they're a variety. China's a huge country, so I believe he spoke Cantonese and she spoke Mandarin, or it may have been reversed. Again, these are completely different languages. So, eventually they use the fortune cookies in order to, for Anna May or Lindu to convince her husband to marry her. Once, basically, because they were dating, even though they were able to speak in mimes and a little bit of English, and it was hard, but they fell in love, and eventually they got married. So, and then it tells the final part of the story is where June goes back to meet her twin sisters. First, they meet up with some of her father's family, who they had not seen in a very long time. And Jing Mei doesn't speak the language, so she doesn't fully understand what's going on. China's huge, and then they go, and it ends with her meeting these sisters, and they look like her. And she lets them know that their mother had died. Now, what had happened to them is they were left on the side of the road, and this couple who lived in the caves would occasionally come out and gather things off the road. They were poor people. They had simple lives, and eventually basically one day when they came out, they found these 2 babies, and they'd never seen jewels or anything like this before, so they take them in. And when they're about 8, I think the woman's husband dies, and she decides, I need to go find these girls' family. But of course, everything has changed. The war has changed everything, so she can't really find them. And so they end up being raised by this woman and always being told sexually, you had your first parents. And eventually, an old schoolmate of their mother's sees them, because she contacts them, because she's trying to get people to help find her twins, but people think she's crazy. It's like, it was during the war. You're not going to find anything. And right before she dies, they had found them. And so June, the book ends with June meeting up with her twin sisters, and she was actually, her name, part of it meant little sister. So her mother never forgot her daughters. So, and that is a way for her to essentially make peace with her mother. And that's how the book ends. It's very interesting. It's a good read. It's definitely, I wouldn't recommend it for any kids younger than high school because they're not going to get it. Again, you have really adult concepts of abortion, children dying at birth, forced marriages, rape, really heavy topics, and divorces, and other kind of difficult topics that younger kids really wouldn't be good at. So it's just not it's not a book I would recommend really until maybe late high school, early high school, depending on your kids' temperament and their maturity level and their knowledge of the world. But again, there's a lot of really heavy topics that are going to be hard for some kids to get and really comprehend. So, like I said, I read it when I was a junior in high school. I was probably about the right age for it. But I was a really sheltered kid, so I didn't know a lot. And I don't remember a lot of it from when I was a child, so it didn't make a huge impact on me. And even when I read it now, as much as I enjoy the story, it doesn't make a huge impact on me because it's not really a linear story. And because she breaks it up, it's hard for me as a dyslexic to follow. So why I definitely highly recommend this book. It's definitely not, the youngest again is freshman in high school, so about 13, 14, if not older. That's the absolute minimum for this book because of the heavy topics and the way it's written it can be difficult to follow in many ways. It's a fantastic book. It's a good look at mother-daughter relationships, particularly with, you have immigrant mothers and American-born daughters. So it's a good way to look at that. I mean, it's a great piece of Asian American history written by someone who is in fact Chinese American. And these are taken bits and pieces from the stories she heard, from her mother's life, from other people that she's done, and completely fictionalized. So it's an award-winning novel. It's very, very good, but as a dyslexic, I have a hard time following it clearly because, again, it's not a cohesive story and things are not entirely set in a linear fashion. You don't have one person's story and another person's story. It also doesn't have full conclusions. I know one of them doesn't, two of them actually get divorced to an extent, or at least one of them is getting divorced. One of them is planning to get divorced. One of them obviously meets her sisters, and then kind of it's interesting. Again, you don't get a lot of satisfying conclusions with the daughters, as opposed to, I remember the film a lot more, and you get more story there. And yes, I will cover that. I intend to rewatch it. I haven't as of this video. So, and then I will cover that. I will cover comparisons, but I wanted to kind of review this cold without comparing it to the film. So it's a fantastic book. It's a lot of hard subjects. It's a lot of hard topics. The mothers lived in China during World War II. Not a fun time. If you're not aware, the Japanese can be very, very vicious, at least when they were in war mode. This is Imperial Japan, and they were pretty vicious to the Chinese. Not that the Chinese can talk. Yeah, there's issues going on now. I'm not going to get into that. For one thing, I'm not Chinese. Never been there. My husband's been there briefly, many years ago. And it may be on our list. I know it's a place my husband wants to visit. But that's years in the future. So I cannot say much about that. But it was a harsh time. I mean, it was war. War is not fun. Ever. There are no winners or no losers in war. Period. My opinion. I mean, a lot of people's opinion. There's no winners or losers in war, really. Everybody's destroyed, particularly the civilian population. But again, there's tough topics. I mean, a woman abandons her children because she thinks she's going to die and she can't carry them anymore. A woman aborts her own child because her husband left her and is a philanderer, and it was a marriage she was forced into. Another woman was forced into another marriage when she's 2. She's promised to a boy who's a year younger than her, and then has to find her way out because they don't want to have sex with each other, and her mother-in-law is horrible to her. Yeah. And another one, like, yeah, she watches her mother cut open her arm and try to save her own mother with her own flesh because she had been raped, because she'd been kicked out of the house and after being raped by another man, and essentially blamed for being raped by another man. Yeah. So the daughters have divorce issues and control issues, and it's very interesting. But again, mature topics that really shouldn't be read until your kids are older. You're looking at Chinese American history and looking for authors that are from that culture. This is a great book to read. It's a great book to read in general. There's a reason it's recommended in some schools. I don't know if it's still being recommended in schools. I hope so. It was a decent book to read. I think the other book that I had the chance to read on the book list was Never Cry Wolf or something. It was Wolf History. My junior year in high school was back in like 2020. It was like a decade ago or 2, almost. It was in 2002, 2001, 2002. It was a long time ago. I don't remember it clearly. It's been a lot of life. So, again, The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. Great book. I'm not sure it's something on my list to add to my physical collection. It might be a digital collection book. Definitely something I will possibly recommend to my children when they're a lot older. Right now I have one child who's 2. Not going there. She's 2. So this is a long, long, long way in the future for us. But great book. Hard to read. If your child's dyslexic, I'm going to lean on the side of no. But that's entirely up to you. Like I said, as a dyslexic myself, I had a hard time following this book. So I had to, through this review, I was skimming the Wikipedia page because it was too hard for me to follow and didn't stick. And yet I know it's a great book and I enjoyed parts of the story. So that is it for this review. If you like what you see, be sure to check out the film review, which will come out Friday. Check out the rest of my book reviews and my film reviews. I have a sprinkling of travel videos going on here. Some secular, non-religious homeschooling videos sprinkled here and there, and a whole bunch more planned. So be sure to like and subscribe and check me out. Thank you.